Hi friends, it's that time of the year for my Apex Legends weapon tier list, and this should help you decide what the best weapons are in Apex Legends Season 13. Now this is all based on feedback from my community, based on a poll I put out on YouTube, plus I have baked in some of my own experience of Season 13 so far. Don't worry if you don't agree with every weapon on this list, let me know your tier list in the comments down below. In my list today I've got S tier to D tier. Now don't forget, just because a weapon might be low on my list, doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. Even the D tier weapons have their uses in certain situations, and for sure, with any of these weapons you can still get downs and kills in the game. So let's jump into this weapons tier list, and we're going to start with D tier. We've got the RE45, the P2020 and the Mozambique. To be fair, the RE45 could creep into C tier, but I've kept it in D tier for now, mainly due to the feedback people have given me about the recoil being too hard to control compared to many other weapons in its category. And I think it's fair to say, off drop, any of these D tier weapons are actually not too bad, but in the late game against Red Evo armor, I think you're going to struggle with any of these weapons. You might have them as secondaries, but certainly not as a primary, and that's why they sit in D tier. And most of the feedback I got on the poll I put out seems to fit with this. Moving on to C tier. Here we've got the 30-30 repeater, the Sentinel, any of the hammer point weapons, the Eva 8, the Hemlock, the Longbow and the L-Star. I don't think many people would argue around the Sentinel being C tier, and if you think about the Longbow as well, it's got a faster fire rate, but then it doesn't quite have the damage of something like the Sentinel, and I think that's why the two are fairly even and sit in C tier. Although having said that, if you're good with these shots and you can hit headshots, obviously being snipers, both can be really effective, which is why I don't think they're bad. It's just for the most part, I'm not seeing them used much this season, and certainly the feedback that I've had from the community indicates that snipers aren't super popular this season, or at least not these two. I've put the hammer points here in C tier as well, but to be fair, something like the RE45 or Mozambique with hammer points could potentially be pushing on low B tier. Again, none of them are really primaries, and I think that's why I've put them in C tier rather than B tier. Certainly they're great secondaries, perhaps the best secondaries against cracked shields. But if you're in the late game and you're up against a Red Evo armor, you're not going to be leading with your hammer points weapon, and therefore as a secondary weapon or a backup weapon, I think C tier probably fits it. But for sure, if you're good with these, you could nudge them up into B tier. The 30-30 repeater also sits in C tier. It's a solid weapon, and there are definitely people out there that are very good at hitting headshots with the 30-30, and if you can do that, this gun might actually be higher than C tier for you. However, if you average it out across the community, this is definitely not the easiest gun to use. The bullet drop is very unique, and a lot of people do miss shots with this gun, so I think C tier is probably a fair place for it. For the Eva 8, there were lots of comments from people saying how weak they feel the Eva 8 is this season, and I would have to agree, which is why I've put it in C tier. The Eva 8 actually used to be really strong, but now, if I'm being completely honest, I think I'd rather have a Mozambique with hammer points over an Eva 8. The Hemlock also sits in C tier, and to be honest, it's just a little bit disappointing for me this season. A few seasons ago, I think all the way back in Season 7, it used to be one of my favourite weapons, but since then it's had numerous nerfs, and the reason it's C tier is because if you compare the Hemlock to the other assault rifles, could you really name another assault rifle that you would choose the Hemlock over? I don't think you could. And there's no doubt if you can hit headshots with the full burst of the Hemlock, it's very good. But the issue is it's just hard to do that, and hence why it's in C tier. The final weapon in C tier is the L-Star. This has dropped down to C tier this season due to the nerfs. Your headshot range is reduced, plus the cooldown time has been increased among other things. And I think it is definitely a solid C tier weapon, but just given all the nerfs, I don't think you're going to be carrying the L-Star through the whole game these days. Let's move on to B tier. In B tier we've got the Charge Rifle, the Bocek Bow, the Triple Take, Devotion, Rampage and Charge Sentinel. Starting with the Charge Rifle, I feel like this is a solid B tier weapon. It's one of the most versatile snipers as it's hit scan, so you can hit at good range on moving targets. I also find it's a good weapon for those of you trying to get the 4k damage badge, because you can just keep tagging enemies and ticking up that damage. I would also say it's one of the most annoying weapons this season. particularly in ranked, because Stormpoint's one of the larger, more open maps, and a weapon like the charge rifle can be really effective on that kind of map, and therefore I feel like B tier kind of fits with where the charge rifle is at right now. The Charged Sentinel is also here, and I thought it was just worth differentiating it from its non-charged version, because when it's charged, it's got the highest headshot damage pretty much out of any floor loot weapon. For some perspective, against red Evo armor with a purple or gold helmet, the Charged Sentinel takes the same number of shots to down as a Kraber does, which is 2 with headshots, and that just gives you some perspective of how the Charged Sentinel really is. It's basically as powerful as the Kraber, although in fairness, the Kraber was nerfed this season. We also have the Devotion sitting here. Now I haven't considered the Turbocharger separate on this list, but to be fair, if you gave the Devotion a Turbocharger, I think that might push it up to an A tier weapon. Without the Turbocharger, it's still very effective. The trick really is to just pre-fire corners, and you can definitely be really effective and get loads of downs with this weapon. The main reason I've left it in B tier rather than A tier is also due to the nerfs it had this season. So for example, the damage is slightly reduced, the headshot multiplier doesn't reach as far, and things like that just mean it's a slightly weaker weapon than it used to be. I've also put the Bocek bow in B tier. At its max, the Bocek bow has a higher DPS than the 30-30 and the triple take, and if it was better close up and the ammo wasn't so hard to find, I think the Bocek bow might actually be A tier. Now if you think about the most annoying weapons in Apex Legends Season 13, I'm not gonna lie, I think the Bocek bow is probably number 1 on that list. It's just so annoying when you get tagged with the Bocek bow, especially those headshots which just do crazy amounts of damage. We've also got the triple take in this category this season. It's not as strong as it used to be, but obviously still a really effective and versatile weapon. You can use it at range like other marksman rifles, but it's also so effective when up close, because you can literally use it like a shotgun. The main reason this isn't in A tier is just because they have nerfed it over the season since it came out of the care package, and you'll find the choked shot is a little bit more reduced and takes longer to cluster your shot, which can make it hard to hit maximum damage with the triple take. The final weapon in B tier is the Rampage. I like the Rampage, but I feel the base model is very average, and I would also add that with the Rampage being in the crafter this season, it feels like the most forgotten weapon in Season 13. Honestly, I don't think I've seen the Rampage more than 2 or 3 times in a game, and that's why I feel like B tier, for the base version at least, is a fair reflection for the Rampage. Moving on to A tier, we've got the Charged Rampage, the Havoc, the Wingman, the Peacekeeper, the Alternator, and the Prowler. These A tier weapons are solid in pretty much any situation. I think the Charged Rampage is a very strong weapon with a great fire rate, and even though the Rampage itself is super rare, if you can get your hands on it with a thermite grenade, it's still an insanely strong weapon. The Havoc also sits in A tier, and that's just simply because it's a solid assault rifle with a great fire rate. Now I would say with a turbocharger, I think the Havoc might even push into S tier, but without the turbocharger it's a solid A tier weapon. It's great early game and late game. And if you think about the fast fire rate with the decent damage and the very little bullet drop, you've got a really effective weapon here if you can control the recoil. I've also put the Peacekeeper in A tier. It requires a lot of good skill, and the ability to flick your shots will certainly help you be more effective with this weapon. Of course, there are Peacekeeper beasts out there that would put this in S tier, and I think if you are one of those people, this probably is an S tier weapon for you. But if you average this weapon out across the community, I think you'll find it's more of a solid A tier weapon, given the amount of times people only hit 9 damage with the PK. It's certainly one of the hardest weapons to hit all your shots with if you're not a specialist with it, and that's why if we look at this tier list as an average across the community, I think you'll find the PKs more of an A tier weapon. I've also put the Wingman in A tier, and this is mainly due to the fire rate and the skill required to use it effectively. Again, like the Peacekeeper, if we average this out across the community and think of this as a weapons tier list that works across the community rather than just the top 0.5%, I think you'll find most of the Wingman users out there are only going to be hitting 1 out of 6 shots with the Wingman, and that's still effective enough to make it an A tier weapon. However, like the PK, if you're one of those Wingman pros, then this is definitely going to be an S tier weapon for you, and definitely if you can hit your headshots or to be honest, even just consistently hit body shots with the Wingman, this is definitely one of the most effective weapons in the game. The final two weapons I've put in A tier are potentially the two most underrated weapons this season that I think are secretly really useful in Season 13, and I certainly had lots of feedback for these two weapons for people saying how good they think they are. The first of these is the Prowler. If you can hit your full burst on the enemy, it's really effective, and if you can add an extended magazine to that, it's even better. Now I do miss the Prowler with the Select Fire, and I think if they brought Select Fire back, the Prowler might even jump into S tier, but right now, as a burst fire weapon, as long as you can hit your bursts, you're going to be getting downs quite easily with this weapon. The Alternator is the other one in A tier. Now I'll be honest, I would probably put the Alternator in B tier, but because so many people in my community gave me feedback saying they thought the Alternator was an A tier weapon, I just went with the consensus, so I put it in A tier mainly due to the feedback. But personally, I think the Alternator is really strong, but it's not on the same level as the CAR or the R99. And that rounds out A tier. Let's move on to our final tier, and this is S tier. The best of the best of the best. We've got the CAR, the R99, the R301, the Spitfire and the Flatline. Now each of these weapons are special in their own right and certainly could be game changers. They're the kind of weapons that you could easily one clip an enemy with a red Evo shield. The CAR and R99 are very similar, with the CAR doing slightly more damage but the R99 having a slightly faster fire rate. Certainly from what I've seen this season, there's no doubt both of these weapons can make a big difference in up close fights, and again in that poll I put out, there's a lot of popular votes for the CAR and R99. I would say the CAR is a little bit more forgiving than the R99 as it does more damage per bullet at 13 compared to 11 on body shots. And that might be why the CAR got slightly more votes in the poll I put out compared to the R99. The R301 is still one of my favourite weapons this season. It's such a consistent weapon and it's really easy to hit mid-range, long range and even up close shots with this weapon. Obviously it's in the crafted this season so it's nowhere near as common as it was, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing because in season 12 when this wasn't in the crafter, literally the whole lobby was rocking an R301. But now that's kind of evened out a little bit where it's not as common, but it is certainly as strong as it's always been. And for sure it's my go-to weapon this season when I'm near a crafter or if I don't already have a flatline. Now I don't think there's much splitting the R301 and the flatline, and it's really just a question of which one do you find first, and also do you prefer higher damage or faster fire rate. But apart from that, they're very even and I think either one of these can win you the game hands down, and that's why I think the flatline and the R301 both have to be S tier. My final weapon on this tier list is the Spitfire. This probably doesn't come as a surprise given that the start of the season felt like Spitfire Legends. I will say it does feel like it's calmed down a little bit, but for sure there are still lots of people just using the Spitfire, which endlessly fires, does loads of damage, and just takes zero skill to hit your shots with. And I would say it does feel like one of the most overpowered weapons this season when used effectively. And I think that's the main reason why the Spitfire has to sit in S tier. I'm fairly confident they will do some further nerfs to the Spitfire to bring it more in line, because it feels so overpowered. Anyway, that's my weapons tier list for Apex Legends Season 13. You might need to adapt this list to suit your playstyle, because different playstyles will rate different weapons in higher tiers, but I hope this gives you some guidance at least. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.